A worrying new picture tonight of the financial burden Canadians are carrying and the anxiety it's creating as higher interest rates and the cost of living stretch budgets. The snapshot comes just days before the Bank of Canada's next rate decision.
We're getting a better sense this morning of how the rising cost of living is affecting Canadians. A new report from Food Banks Canada is looking at food bank usage in this country, and numbers aren't just up. They're at historic high levels.
In the bustling provinces and quaint towns that dot the Canadian landscape, a silent cyclone is brewing, a storm of financial bedlam threatening to shatter the foothold of the Canadian economy. This is the reality of the rising cost of living, a crisis that has been quietly gathering strength for decades, but is now poised to explode with a fury that could leave countless Canadians struggling to keep their heads above water. At first glance, the signs of trouble are easy to miss. A few extra dollars for groceries here, a higher utility bill there, tiny pinpricks in the monthly budget that are easy to dismiss or ignore. However, as the years turn into decades, these small increases compound and multiply, slowly eroding the purchasing power of the average Canadian and making it harder and harder to make ends meet. According to Statistics Canada, the Consumer Price Index, the most widely used measure of inflation, has steadily increased, reaching a year-over-year increase of 6.8% in April 2022. That's the highest inflation rate in over 3 decades, which means that the cost of everyday goods and services is rising faster than it has at any point in recent memory. A new RBC survey suggests rising costs of living tops Canadians' list of worries according to the poll, with 77% of respondents saying they are not able to save as much as they would like to, and roughly half saying they've never been more stressed about money. If inflationary pressures continue from 2024, the poll finds that 72% of respondents with debt are worried about taking on more debt, while 21% said they might have to come out of retirement. A recent study estimated that fewer than 2% of households used a food bank during a 3-month period in the early months of the pandemic. However, the latest statistics from Food Banks Canada indicate that the need for and use of food banks has been increasing since June of 2020. But what's driving this relentless march of prices? The answers are complex and multifaceted, but they all point to a system that is increasingly out of balance. A system where the cost of living is rising faster than incomes, where housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable, and where basic necessities of life are slipping out of reach for more and more Canadians. In this video, we will shed light on Canada's ever-increasing cost of living, the dire consequences, and the impact of this economic upheaval on citizens. We will also consider the various pile-driving forces that would keep aggravating this inflationary circumstance, highlighting what would happen to the ordinary Canadian if the cost of living continues to rise. One of the biggest culprits behind the rising cost of living is the high cost of housing. For generations, owning a home was a cornerstone of the Canadian dream, a symbol of stability, security, and prosperity. But in recent years, that dream has become increasingly out of reach for many Canadians, particularly those in major urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver. According to the Canadian Real Estate Association, the average home price in Canada rose 2.7% month over month and was up 23.4% year over year, reaching a staggering $713,500. In Toronto, the average price of a detached home now stands at over $1.4 million, while in Vancouver, it has soared to over $2.2 million. For many Canadians, particularly young people and those on low or moderate incomes, these prices are simply unattainable. But it's not just the cost of buying a home squeezing Canadian households. Rents, too, have been rising at an alarming rate, particularly in major cities where the demand for housing far outstrips the supply. According to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in the country rose by 5.6% in 2022, with Toronto reaching an eye-watering $1,779 monthly. Meanwhile, in Vancouver, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment now stands at $2,002 per month, beating the national average of $1,258. For many Canadians, these housing costs are simply unsustainable. A recent report found that a minimum wage worker in Toronto would need to work 79 hours per week just to afford the average 1-bedroom apartment. In Vancouver, a minimum wage worker would need to work 112 hours per week, the equivalent of nearly 3 full-time jobs just to keep a roof over their head. But housing is just one piece of the affordability puzzle. Canadians are also being squeezed by rising costs for other basic necessities such as food, transportation, and childcare. According to Statistics Canada, the cost of food rose by 9.7% the year leading up to April 2022, the largest increase since 1981. For a family of 4, that translates to an extra $966 per year in grocery costs alone. When asked in which area they were most affected by rising prices during the 6 months preceding the survey, 43% of Canadians answered food. After food, the most affected areas were transportation at 32%, shelter at 9%, and household operations at 8%. Transportation costs, too, have been rising at an alarming rate. The average cost of owning a car in Canada is over $1,300 a month, or $15,600 annually. According to a 2021 Statistics Canada report, the overall cost of transportation for the average Canadian makes up around $10,000, or 15% of annual living expenses, ranking third behind food and shelter. Gasoline prices contributed most to the year-over-year headline acceleration, as prices at the pump rose faster in March compared with February. Excluding gasoline, the all-items CPI slowed to a 2.8% year-over-year increase, down from a 2.9% gain in February. And then there's childcare, a necessity for many working families, but one that is becoming increasingly unaffordable. The average cost of infant, toddler, and preschool-age childcare in Toronto is the most expensive, with a monthly median price of $1,866, $1,578, and Canadian $1,250, a cost that is simply out of reach for many low and moderate income families. In some cities such as Vancouver, the cost of childcare can exceed $2,000 per month, more than the cost of rent for many families. But while the cost of living is rising across the board, incomes are not keeping pace. According to Statistics Canada, the median after-tax income for Canadian households rose by just 1.9% in 2021, a far cry from the 6.7% increase in the Consumer Price Index. For many Canadians, this means that their purchasing power is slowly being eroded year after year as the cost of living outpaces their income growth. And then there are taxes, the hidden cost that eats away at Canadians' hard-earned income and makes it even harder to make ends meet. According to the Fraser Institute, the average Canadian family now spends more of its income on taxes, 45.3%, than it does on basic necessities such as food, shelter, and clothing combined at 35.6%. By comparison, 33.5% of the average family's income went to pay taxes in 1961, while 56.5% went to basic necessities. In 2022, the average Canadian family earned an income of $106,430 and paid total taxes equaling $48,199, approximately 45.3% of the total earnings. Conversely, in 1961, the average family had an income of $5,000 and paid a total tax bill of $1,675, or 33.5%. That's a staggering amount of citizens' income going straight to the government, leaving less and less for the basic necessities of life. But it's not just the high cost of living that is squeezing Canadian households, it's also the fact that incomes are not keeping pace with the rising cost of living. Although wage increases have been at an all-time high, they will likely be soaked up by higher prices and debt costs in the coming years, lowering disposable incomes. As of November 2022, average hourly earnings rose by 10% compared to pre-pandemic levels, the fastest pace over a time period of that length since the 1990s. But that still wasn't enough to catch inflation, which soared 12% above where it was before the crisis. As workers grappled with higher prices, they were also saddled with an almost 20% jump in debt servicing costs, as the Bank of Canada aggressively raised interest rates. This means that for many Canadians, their purchasing power is slowly being eroded year after year as the cost of living outpaces their income growth. So what happens if this trend continues? What will life look like for Canadians in 5, 10, or 20 years if living costs continue to rise faster than incomes? The picture is not a pretty one. For one thing, the dream of home ownership will become increasingly out of reach for all but the wealthiest Canadians. According to projections by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the average home price in Canada could reach $3.5 million by 2030, a staggering 68% increase from current levels. In major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, prices could easily exceed $2 million or even $3 million. For renters, the situation will be even more dire. If current trends continue, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto could easily exceed $300,000 $3,000 per month by 2030, while in Vancouver it could reach $4,000 or more. This would put affordable housing out of reach for all but the highest earners, forcing more and more Canadians into overcrowded or substandard living conditions. But it's not just housing that will become increasingly unaffordable. If current trends continue, the cost of groceries, transportation, and other basic necessities will also exponentially rise at an alarming rate. According to one study, at $50 per ton, the carbon tax would increase food prices by 3%. The carbon tax is set to rise to $65 per ton in April, ultimately soaring to $170 per ton in 2030, meaning the carbon tax's upward pressure on the price of food and other goods is just beginning. For the average Canadian family, this could mean spending an extra $3,000 or more per year on groceries alone, a cost that would be difficult to absorb for those already struggling to make ends meet. With transportation costs also projected to rise by 20% or more over the same period, many Canadians could be forced to choose between putting food on the table and filling up their gas tank. But perhaps the most devastating impact of the rising cost of living will be on low and moderate income Canadians, those who are already struggling to keep their heads above water. For these individuals and families, even a slight increase in the cost of living can be catastrophic, forcing them to make impossible choices between paying rent, buying food, or accessing healthcare. Reports have been shown that nearly half of all Canadian workers live paycheck to paycheck with no savings to fall back on in an emergency. For these individuals, a sudden illness, job loss, or unexpected expense could quickly push them over the edge into poverty and homelessness. But the rising cost of living is not just a matter of supply and demand, it is also a result of conscious policy choices by government at all levels. One of the biggest culprits is high government spending, which drives up the cost of living by increasing the tax burden on Canadian households and businesses. According to a report by the Fraser Institute, government spending in Canada has substantially contributed to this predicament. Combined federal, provincial, and municipal government spending across Canada accounts for 40.5% of the entire Canadian economy, far above the ideal level of 26% to 30% needed to maximize economic growth. And then there is immigration, a necessary and valuable part of Canada's social and economic fabric, but one that can also contribute to the rising cost of living if not managed carefully. Currently, annual immigration in Canada amounts to almost 500,000 new immigrants, one of the highest rates per population of any country in the world. As of 2023, there were more than 8 million immigrants with permanent residence living in Canada, roughly 20% of the total Canadian population. While immigration can bring many benefits to Canada, such as filling labor shortages and driving economic growth, it can also put pressure on the economy, leading to increased competition for resources and driving up the cost of living for everyone. These factors, high housing costs, restrictive zoning laws, high government spending, and a poorly managed flow of immigrants into the country contribute to Canada's rising cost of living. The path forward will be challenging and require political courage, but pursuing bold solutions to rein in living costs is a moral and economic imperative for Canada. Failure to act decisively risks a future where financial stability becomes a pipe dream for growing numbers of Canadians, and socioeconomic inequalities spiral out of control. Beyond just the dollars and cents, this would threaten the very foundation of Canada's cherished middle class and the promise of a society where everyone has a fair shot at achieving their dreams through honest work. It would be an unconscionable betrayal of the values and aspirations that have made this country a beacon of hope and opportunity for generations. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.